It's a great honor and privilege to be reunited here with Chris, because we met many, many years ago thanks to Russell Haswell, the composer and sound artist whom I asked whom we should listen to, and he said it's urgent to listen to Chris Watson. Of course, very wonderful to meet Carlos. A very big round of applause again to Carlos for his talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Now, Carlos, a few first questions for you. I wanted to kind of ask you actually about your influences, how you came to plants, and you said in previous interviews that, of course, David Attenborough was important for you. Also, Jane Goodall, with whom we worked at the Serpentine on the occasion of the Rosemary Trockel exhibition, Jacques Cousteau, and then from Spain, Felix Rodriguez de la Fuente. Could you tell us a little bit about these inspirations? And I'm particularly curious about Felix Rodriguez de la Fuente, who is less known than the others.
Well, I guess that, like any other kid, I was very interested into the natural world. I think it's something which is instinctive in any single kid. So it's nothing special about it. It's just that I believe in most kids this thing dies, or better say, actually we kill it, and then they stop exploring the natural environment because they don't have access to it, and then there are other things like cranes and bin lorries which call their attention. But in my case, I have the privilege of being in a very wild part of Spain called Asturias, in which you have things like bears and wolves and golden eagles and all of this, 30 kilometers away from one of the biggest kinds of metal industry plants on Spain. So from a very young age, I was seeing this contrast of industrial and natural world and how the human presence means no life. But then later on, these people, Cousteau and Attenborough and Felix Rodriguez de la Fuente, brought to the kind of big screen, which, you know, in TV, in those days everybody was watching TV all the time because there wasn't so much social media or internet. And when they asked the kids what they want to be, I didn't even have a word for what I want to be. I want to be Felix Rodriguez de la Fuente, I want to be Attenborough, I want to be Jane Goodall, because that is not a profession. And then they will tell me, so you want to be a presenter? I was like, no, because I don't want to present sport stuff. So you want to be a biologist? And I was like, not really, because I don't want to be in a lab testing crazy stuff, totally in sterile conditions, you know? So there wasn't, in Spain, there wasn't even a language to describe this. I believe that this is being a natural scientist, which you cannot study in any university, can you? And it's more like a kind of mental stage. And I think that these people are really important and very relevant because they were able to capture the essence of what is out there and how the world works and deliver it to your living room while you're having dinner, and start changing people's perceptions about nature. You know, in Spain, when I grew up, it was Franco was there, which was a right-wing dictator, and there was this thing about exterminating everything. There was even a national ministry called the Alliance for the Extermination of Pernicious Animals and Plants. And people will go around shooting everything, and every head of every animal will have a price. And you will get with your van into the office, and then they will pay you for everything, even mouse, snakes, whatever. So this guy managed to break with that, you know, and then make everybody understand that actually nature is amazing. And I believe they are very important, and I believe that we are in a moment which is quite strange and anomalous, because when we have a huge urgency to protect the natural world, it happens that Cousteau is dead, Felix Rodriguez de la Fuente is dead, Attenborough is 94, I believe, and Jane Goodall is 87. And there doesn't seem to be a young relay there to replace them. So what is going to happen? Who is going to educate people like me, which is being born now?
Yeah, there is you and your incredible practice and book, and there is also Stefano Mancuso, whom I worked with actually on a project with Carsten Höller when we did this book for Florence. It was an incredible experiment with plants, an entire exhibition where Carsten developed a laboratory of plants with Mancuso. And as you saw, we actually used Stefano Mancuso's quote here for the press release of today's symposium. I'm going to read you that quote. Most people who bother to think about plants at all tend to regard them as the mute, immobile furniture of our world, useful enough and generally attractive, but obviously second-class citizens in the republic of life on Earth. So I wanted to ask you to react to that quote and also how you relate to Mancuso's work.
Yeah, well, I guess that he's right, but I don't think it's so much the people which actually cares about plants. It's actually the ones that they don't care. If that makes sense, that they see plants like a green paint in the landscape and that they are there to make your landscape more beautiful if you're lucky. But it is true, it's what I call in the book, I call it plant blindness. We don't see them anymore. There is 450,000 species of plants in there, but they are just plants. You know, they are not in our daily agenda, in the media, or in the news, or in the fashion, or in the arts, yet they are the basis of everything we do, including literature is written in paper, or everything we eat comes from a plant or from something which eats a plant. 3 out of 4 medicines come from plants. Every single molecule of oxygen we breathe comes from a plant. Yet, do we all plants sometimes, and why this is relevant to us? And I think the answer for that is no, no? I don't think we give them the importance that they really have.
So that's a really important point, no? And that's of course something which also another author who inspires us a lot at the Serpentine writes about Anat Singh, and there is this amazing book, Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet, which is probably Anat Singh's work. Whenever I go to artist studios, I see Anat Singh's books in the studio. Is one of the most read authors by artists, and the book discusses the loss of species as ghosts and the chimeras which come into being only through our altered environment, actually as monsters. So I wanted to ask you, in a way, can we ask today somehow the thoughts about the plant species which have flourished in the face of adversity, which are growing amongst, railway lines or toxic wastelands? Could you talk about that?
Yeah, well, sometimes we see them as invasives and as like if they were a kind of alien thing which came from the other space, and actually they are there because us. And actually, I think we should learn a lesson from this. Basically, even when we destroy the world, the natural world fights back by coming back with other type of organisms which adapt to these constructions. Like, for example, the Bodleian here in London seems to have been evolved into living into derelict walls and railways, isn't it? So basically, if you give them a chance, they will always occupy it, and they will work around whatever situation is this, which should send the message to us that we are irrelevant, really. That doesn't matter how much we do into the natural world. The natural world will survive. It's not the altruistic thing that we may think it is. It's obviously, I think, there is something really terrible about destroying a forest which has been there for 10,000 years and which holds a lot of life, but I think in the end, it's not just altruism. It's in our best interest to protect that forest. If that makes sense, it's not just being here the typical, oh, I am a hippie, I just want peace and love. No, it's really vital for us that we preserve these environments and we preserve this biodiversity, because we are the first interested in doing so.
Now, when we talked about your work with Lucia and Kostas last week, one of the things which we really felt is urgent to ask you is the notion of witchcraft, and because you use that more often than the kind of notion of science. And of course, we have the exhibition. It's actually an exhibition which is ending today at the Serpentine of Emma Kunz, the Swiss healer, researcher, artist, spiritualist, medium, and she basically did these extraordinary drawings in the 30s and 40s, basically parallel to her healing practice. She also discovered the healing qualities of this ion, of this stone in Switzerland, and basically it's sold until today in every Swiss pharmacy with her little drawing on it. She kind of designed her own logo for this product, ion. So I just want to ask you to tell us a little bit about that, because it seems an interesting connection.
I guess that thing of I do witchery comes from, I remember I was in a small congress and everybody was introducing themselves as, I am this person, I work in this lab, I am a scientist. And then the next one was, I am this other person, I work in this natural history museum, I am a scientist. But I am a horticulturist. And apparently, this is not science. So when it came to me, I say like, well, my name is Magdalena, I am a horticulturist, I must be a witch. Because if what I do is not a science, how does it come? I do stuff. Because sometimes there is this perception that only academical science in a lab, in controlled conditions, in sterile conditions, under a very boring type of procedure, can do something which is relevant to science. And if you think, and this is really important, you know, I'm not trying to slack this off and dismiss this off, but I think there has to be also another type of scientist too, which understand how, for example, politics work and how society works and how to communicate this, because otherwise it's just a piece of data in a kind of folder somewhere for the connoisseur, which doesn't really have any impact despite the amazing impact that it has. And also I believe that, for example, as horticulturist, I am always using a science, but rather than from the lab, I use it in the other way around. You are here, and then the humidity has some data, and the temperature has other one, and a plant is in a pot, and one is wilting, the other one it isn't. Maybe the one which is wilting is because the pot is black, and then the sun make it hotter. So then, solution, put it in a pot which is brown. So I use the science to do stuff, rather than producing the raw, basic science that then somebody else does. And I found that that is very often missed. You know, you can then use science as a tool to try to get you to somewhere, and use many different disciplines. And I think that is something which is often missed in scientific institutions. We focus too much into the just academical Britain side of it.
But the reason why we wanted to have you both, you know, together on stage is actually really the idea of listening. The 20th century, as I said earlier, was a lot about manifestos. When we did the Manifesto Marathon, you know, actually it was very interesting that several speakers, Tino Segal, Etelat Nan, they all said, you know, we need now more listening to the planet, listening to each other than loud manifestos. And both of your practices have a lot to do with listening. And before I'm asking Chris questions about listening, I have a question to you about that. Because what is interesting is that you said in the previous interview I read this morning that in a single leaf there are constellations of cells, each containing numerous chatty people, delivering speeches at the chemical level. So obviously, you know, us speaking here today, it's interesting that we think about these speeches of plants. And I wanted to ask you how we could actually listen to these speeches.
Well, for an animal like us, it's very difficult to listen to this because we are talking about tiny molecules thrown into a soup of many other molecules. So we can just get small snapshots of here and there. It's like if in a book you can only open a random page and get a random word and try to work out what the book is all about. But plants have this crazy communication by chemicals at all levels. Like, for example, there is studies which demonstrate that a tomato plant which is in a room separated from another tomato plant which is in another room but connected by the roots across the wall can tell this plant that I have aphids, make ready for the warfare because it's coming to you. Because the plant, if you put the aphid, one starts putting the chemical and the other one automatically does it when it's not exposed to the chemical. Or, for example, acacias, they have this pest, which they have a predator, which is a small wasp, and when they get this predator, they start putting some volatiles, which is kind of like calling for Superman, you know? They go in the wind and then they pinpoint to these wasps where this pest is, kind of like making them exposed. So, and then when you look at a tree, like a sequoia, which is like maybe 100 meters tall, and then it has a massive root ball of maybe 50 meters wide, there will be millions and trillions of root tips in there, all of them exploring where the humidity is, where every single nutrient you need, which is not only nitrogen, phosphate, is many more. How all of this communicates in the whole massive organism when you actually don't have a nervous system. And it's something that fascinates me. And obviously, you could say that this is witchery. I believe it is not. It's just that our animal condition prevents us from trying to understand further than the tip of the iceberg at the moment. How you can have intelligence without a brain is something which doesn't fit in our brain, does it?
Wonderful, and it resonates very much, Chris, with what you once told me, because you often said that we have to open our ears and listen to a place. That's the first thing you told me when you met, that we not just hear it, but that we actually listen to it. Can you tell us about listening?
Well, the fact is we're all good listeners. You know, we're all listening to what's happening here. My idea, such as it is, that we've evolved from people who are good listeners. We don't have earlids. We're listening all the time, even when we're asleep. I contend that we've evolved from the people who 40,000 years ago in the caves of Lascaux or New Mexico who were creating cave art, when people were, all of us, in our extended families were sleeping in those caves at night, and a saber-toothed tiger or a clan of spotted hyenas came into the cave, we've evolved from the people that woke up and escaped out of the back of the cave. Those people that didn't hear those animals approach aren't around to come to this symposium today because they hit an evolutionary dead end. So it might be sort of simplistic and glib, but I'm convinced that we're all good listeners, and we don't need to be taught that. We need to be given the opportunity. I mean, we live in such, particularly here in Western Europe, such a noise-polluted environment that we don't get the chance, and so we shut ourselves in with iPod earbuds and headphones and isolate ourselves from the noise. But given the opportunity, which is something that I have the privilege of a lot when I go to locations, or when you go to that remarkable place in Colombia, 1,000 meters up, I mean, what a stunning environment. I would love to have been able to hear that as well and record it. I think that often captures and represents a sense of spirit of place with sound, which is something I'm hoping that the piece this evening will do, convey that sense by giving us the chance to listen in this remarkable acoustic system.
Of course, it's wonderful that it's called Earth. It could not have a better name. So what is interesting also is, before we talk more about the piece you are going to experience tonight, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your beginnings, because I wanted to ask you what prompted you to record your surroundings, the sounds around you, because you've got, last night we spoke about this amazing archive you have. You've got an extraordinary archive of sounds you have been recording, and an archive which really in that sense fights extinction. Could you tell us how this all began? Because I hear rumors that it had to do something with childhood and birds, and the birds you heard through a window. Is that true?
You've done your research, Hans Ulrich, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I have told this story because it's something that I remember frequently, because when I was about, 12 or 13, my parents, I grew up in Sheffield, in the north of England, but in the centre of the country. My parents bought me a small, portable, reel-to-reel tape recorder, a national tape recorder, which I've still got on the shelf in my studio. So I must have been about 13, and it was battery-operated, and it had a microphone, a captive microphone that you could plug in on a meter of cable. And I recorded everything in the house, the doors creaking, and the washing machine, and the taps, and the toilet flushing, and all the usual things. And then I looked out of the window, and in our back garden in Sheffield, through the kitchen window, we had a bird table that my parents had put up. And you could, of course, see the birds feeding through the window, but you couldn't hear it. And I felt at the time it was a bit like watching a silent film, because you could see all this remarkable activity, but I was detached from it, and I couldn't hear it. And I realized this tape recorder had batteries in it, so I could take it outside. So I went out, scared all the birds off, put some bird seed on the table, put the captive microphone on the edge, hung my tape recorder underneath, switched it to record, and ran back in the house. And eventually the birds returned just before the tape ran out, because it only had 8 or 10 minutes of tape. And so I went back out, got the tape back, and I like to think I can remember that moment of playing back that sound recording and being taken to a place where none of us can ever be, because our behavior would affect that environment. So it wasn't only the time shifting, it was that aspect of literally discovering a new place through sound. And then I went on to discover the creative potential of tape recorders, and not just the documentation aspect of them.
I've asked Carlos about inspirations. We talked about Attenborough and others. And I read also that William Burroughs was an inspiration for you. And I actually met William Burroughs when I just started to be a curator in the 90s, and I worked on a painting show with Caspar Koenig. So I went to an opening of Ed Ruscha, and it was actually a double opening of Ed Ruscha and William Burroughs, and I happened to sit next to William Burroughs at that dinner. And Burroughs actually talked about some recordings he made in Tangier. He talked about sound, and it's something which inspired you. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, through his I was always interested, at that time particularly, I was interested in the creative potential of tape recorders, and so I was interested in Pierre Schaeffer, musique concrète, and the work of the French composers in the 1950s, the late 1940s. As a teenager, I was astonished to discover that people could use this instrument, well, this recorder as a creative instrument. And of course, Burroughs, with the electronic revolution, documents a lot of his work in Tangiers and the manipulation of sound through that, which is something I was fascinated by. And it's something which Throbbing Gristle released as an album, Nothing Here Now But the Recordings. There's a 12-inch vinyl, which I think Genesis at the time arranged to get copies of those recordings. I don't think it ever appeared on CD, but it was part of the Industrial Records catalogue very early on. So I was interested by all of that and by that crossover of science and art. And one of the things which is, of course, what we're doing here today, that I found that a really fertile ground. It really fed and charged my imagination as I began to explore not only just sound recording, but the creative use, the sculptural aspect, particularly of quarter-inch tape, which nostalgically now I refer to because we've lost that ability. Everything now is on a screen and it's literally untouchable. But I really enjoyed that aspect of being able to sculpt sound. I didn't actually meet William Burroughs, but I was at a festival once at the Plan Car in Brussels a long time ago with Maggie, who's sat here now. And I was actually at the bar with Ian Curtis from Joy Division, and William Burroughs came down and walked past us. That was my closest contact to him. There was an incident at the time, but anyway, yeah.
That's incredible. And another, inspiration is, of course, Murray Schafer, the composer and researcher on acoustic ecology, and also the founder of the World Soundscape Project. And Murray Schafer wrote, "We must seek a way to make environmental acoustics a positive study program. Which sounds do we want to preserve, encourage, multiply?" Could you tell us about that?
Well, I'm very optimistic about that. Murray Schafer and the World Soundscape Forum and the society that he started in Vancouver with Hildegard Vesterkamp, who I'm a great admirer of her work. I think the times are changing, aren't they? We've all, one of the reasons why this is happening today, why I like doing these events, is we're rediscovering listening. You asked me, your first question was about that, because we're searching for it, I think, and people are seeking it out. And the workshops that I do, I'm astonished by the amount of people that turn up, to be honest, the efforts and the expense people go to come and work with me on one aspect, but mainly to go out and discover the world sonically, because it's so important. It's like plants. It's something that you referred to it. We hear everything, but we rarely get the opportunity to listen. And we're losing those places. But I think the tide has turned, to paraphrase. We're now realizing that this is important. And with the work of people like Gordon Hempton with his 1 square inch of silence in the Olympic Park in Washington, people are starting to rediscover it for themselves. And they're seeking it out. They want it. They demand it. We live in such poorly designed acoustic environments. Architects should hang their heads in shame with most new buildings because they are so acoustically dreadful. You can't work in them, you can't communicate in them. You go home at night bad-tempered with a headache, sick building syndrome. Anyway, let's not talk about that. Let's be happy.
That could be a whole other topic of a conference. It would actually be hugely fascinating, in terms of to discuss that with architects. We should do that. Now, in terms of the conference today, I wanted to ask you a little bit more concretely to tell us about how you would go about recording fish or plants. What techniques are required? Because it is, of course, always a form of mapping, I suppose. So, and you did, for example, a sound piece for the Tail Arts Festival in Torbay, which is called No Man's Land, which utilizes, the sound of the sea, where you go underwater. So I just wanted to hear more, and I think it would be great for all of us here to hear more how to record. Also, in connection to what you said, how to record actually fish and how to record plants.
Well, plants is uppermost in my mind at the moment. It was interesting because I'm just about to start a new series with David Attenborough about plants, about revisiting the life of plants, which was shot, I think, in the 1970s. So I'm starting a new project with David later this autumn and continuing to next year. And one of the directors has specifically asked me about how they can get the sounds of plants and root systems in particular, which is something I'm exploring with contact microphones and geophones. I tried a little bit as an experiment in Kielder Forest, where using actually hydrophones, which are underwater microphones, which are used for recording fish. But if you bury them in a substrate, so bury them in the ground near, so let's say, shallow-rooted trees, such as coniferous trees, when the wind blows, the whole tree shifts. And like some of the Araucaria trees, I guess, that were in Argentina that I've also recorded by, as the tree shifts, the root system, because it's shallow-rooted, the root shift and system moves. So you hear it creaking and groaning. And that connection that you made with the network of, the fiber network of roots, because sound travels so much better through ground, through the earth, than it does through air, that sense of vibration and movement can be detected over kilometers. So you hear the sound of a forest from underneath the surface, straining and groaning when the winds hit the top of the conifers. It's revealed in a very different way. I don't know if you've ever experienced that.
Well, something which I found very interesting is that each species of tree in the wind makes a different noise. Depending on the structure of the branches and the leaves, it will, the sound will be totally different. And you can sometimes recognize them by that noise. It's not the same, for example, a poplar forest and an oak forest or a beech forest. And some of them, the wood squeaks a lot in the wind, isn't it? It makes these different sounds. And I believe there is a science which is researching that. The different species, how it has a different kind of frequency depending on the wind. Yeah.
Yes. Noticeably, as you know, coniferous trees, which the leaves are reflected by the needles, have this very signature mono sound as the air rushes through the needles, which is very different from a deciduous forest. And these latitudes here with large leaves, beech trees, oak leaves at the moment, which have totally different frequencies. So that's you're right. You could close your eyes, and I'm sure you could recognize the forest.
And sometimes, like in big valleys, you may be at, let's say, 1,000 meters, and then 300 meters down, there is wind, and there is no wind here, and you can hear this noise passing down, like if it was a Mexican wave in a stadium, when you are actually very far away from this.
And fish. Let's talk about recording fish, Hans Ulrich. Yeah. Sorry, you want to say?
I was going to say that interestingly, I may be wrong on this one, but I believe that the air of the human evolved from some of the gills of the primitive type of fish related to shark. So the jaw comes from one of the gills, and then I think the air is made out of the other two gills. So that's why sharks have like 5 or 6 gills, and then modern fish have less, because all of this has been incorporated into our jaws and our air.
Yes,
so
bone conduction. Yeah,
so there is a link there, isn't it?
We certainly hear in a similar way to something like marine mammals anyway, the whales and dolphins in that respect. I was out recording fish in Norway off the western coast a few weeks ago with a good friend of mine, Jarne Vinderen, whose work I would highly recommend. We were recording cod spawning, and the Norwegians are very interested in retaining their populations of cod, obviously, and they have a lot of research and a lot of money to do the research because of their oil that they've captured. And they have the Institute of Marine Research, really interesting group of scientists. And Karen de Jong, we were on a boat with Karen de Jong, who was researching the sounds of cod, because cod sing. They have this and they spawn in February, so we were out there at the end of February. And as cod are about to spawn, they have this parallel swimming, so the males and females swim side by side using the very sensitive lateral line. And the males produce this popping, gurgling sound, and the females purr. It's this really beautiful purring sound. And the duet, at the moment where fertilization takes place, she releases the eggs, the males release the milt into the seawater, and the eggs are fertilized at that moment. That relies on the fish being able to hear each other. And with the amount of noise pollution we're putting into the oceans, seismic testing, examining below the sea floor for yet more sort of oil, and some of the military uses of it, there are areas where fish literally can't hear each other. If they can't hear each other, they can't reproduce. And there's a lot of really quite damning evidence about fish stocks being pushed further and further away in places like underneath the sea ice, where the piece I've made for tonight will start, and the Barents Sea, into colder water, taking the fish longer to come to maturity, so the reproduction rate is reduced.
That's a great transition actually to my very last question. I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit more about what's going to happen tonight. It's going to be the great finale of today, and we all look so much forward to it. It would be great to hear from you, so we can...
It's a new piece. It's a commission from Serpentine in cooperation with Acoustics, the people who put these astonishing speakers into this place. And so it's a big surround system. And is it 24 channels, Luca? Yeah, 24-channel sound system. And I was interested when Lucia asked me about this. I immediately, when I just read the title, I interpreted some of it literally, took the circular thing into mind, fish, and thought about something I've considered for a long time, the journey of salmon, this remarkable animal which makes this remarkable journey, usually a solitary return journey because they die after this spawning. And somewhere at the moment, they're out in the Barents Sea, in the depths of the North Atlantic, or the Barents Sea, or the Arctic Ocean, and they'll soon start to be drawn back, and we don't know why, along with currents. So it's the sound of a journey, and the sounds that they experience on the way. So you'll hear tonight bearded seals singing under the sea ice. You be amongst, in this astonishing setup, a hunting pod of 200 orcas, which are recorded off the Lofoten Islands, which is quite a terrifying experience when you hear it in this place. Grey seals on the Farne Islands, and then finally making their journey up the River Coquet to a place where Maggie and I went just a few weeks ago to record the final piece. The moment of transition. The three realms in the title refers to the fact that salmon are one of the very, very few animals that can exist in three realms: salt water, fresh water, and air, rather like plants. They can exist in all three, and they make a journey through all three realms back to the spawning grounds. And that's where we'll go tonight.
That could not be a more wonderful conclusion. Chris and Carlo, thank you so much. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.